folks, we're going to get started. My name is Maddie Elfenbein. I am a PhD candidate in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. That's what it's called. And I stand by that. And I'm also one of the coordinators of the Race and Pedagogy Working Group, along with my colleagues up here, Amanda Michelle Jones and Emily Marker. And my job here is just to let you know that the Race and Pedagogy Working Group is a relatively new entity on this campus. We have a really excellent website. It's Chicago raceandpedagogy.wordpress.com. Check it out. We will be having more events starting next quarter and through the rest of the year, and we're very eager to make this the kind of program that that involves you who've come out to this event. So please do get in touch and come to our next reading group, our next discussion, or whatever it turns out to be. And with that, turn it over to Amanda Michelle.
I'm going to piggyback off of that and say you should go to the website and sign up for our listserv.
Oh, yeah.
Because then you'll know what stuff is and when and where stuff is happening. But also there are lots of resources available, and it's always growing. But for today, one of the resources that we're really excited that's on the website is this book, this glorious shiny new book by Derald Wing Sue. I'm a little snarky, so please enjoy yourselves with me. But we're going to be talking about race talk today and why it's hard and what are we going to do about it. So for the first 15 or 20 minutes, Emily's going to kind of give an overview of the book and specifically kind of his main points and what strategies he discusses for doing race talk. And then Maddie and I are going to kind of give our reflections on the book. And Emily's going to respond with some comments as well. But we really, really want to have a discussion. And so even if you haven't read the book, we want to hear what you think about what we think, and or what we thought, or what have you, what your experiences were, what you're hoping for, etc. So with that, I'll turn it over to Emily.
So I'm going to give a pretty schematic presentation of this book. The book already is pretty schematic, so I apologize for a lot of bullet points and parts A, B, and C. And I'm going to go into some depth just so that we can maybe have more substantive conversation later. But just out of curiosity, did anybody read the first chapter on the Okay, so that's good. Should I have to hurry up and skip over some things? The goals of the book, as Sue defines them, is to uncover reasons why race talk is so difficult, expose explicit and hidden rules that govern how race is discussed in contemporary American society, illuminate detrimental consequences of failures to honestly dialogue about race, outline some benefits of successful conversations about race, and propose solutions in overcoming obstacles to honest racial dialogues. So really what this book is trying to do is talk about the psychology of racial dialogues and meaning, importance, and benefits they have for our society. So he sort of walks us through his background is a social psychology background, I suppose. He's a professor at Teachers College at Columbia. And the sources in here that he's using are focus groups of students, educators, and other people that he assembled, and then also psychological studies of others. So why is race talk so difficult? The first point he makes is that race talk represents a clash of racial realities. So this, can kind of be represented, in the sort of invisibility of whiteness for white participants in race talk versus the constant daily microaggressions experienced by people of color that they're bringing to race talk. And so what you have there are two totally different experiences that are mediating how people are talking about things. And then on top of that, you have these competing narratives, what he calls white talk versus black talk. And so he characterizes race talk as a form of storytelling in which there's this master narrative, which is white talk, which depicts historical and cultural themes of racial progress, the fact that we live in a fair and just society, equal access to opportunity, what he calls the myth of meritocracy, and then also the logic of colorblindness. Whereas people of color's own tales of daily microaggressions and racism constitute a counter-narrative to that master narrative, right? And that's why he calls it back talk. So in these encounters, in race talk, when people of color and white people are trying to talk about race, because of those contrasting experiences, what he says is that race talk often reenacts the entire history of race relations in the US. And therefore, race talk, having successful race talk, is a socio-political act in and of itself. So then the second point that he goes on at length about is race and emotions. And what he tries to draw out is how there's a totally different range of emotions that people of color and white people experience in race talk, in race dialogues. So these are, it's a hot button issue for everyone, but the way that gets manifested for people is different, right? So on the one side, you have feelings of anger, resentment, pessimism, hopelessness, frustration, a sense of being tired, embarrassment, what have you. Whereas then on the white side of things, you'll have these intense and overwhelming emotions. He goes through this vignette where in the process of trying to have a conversation about race in a classroom, one of the white students breaks down and starts crying. And then everybody comforts the white student and basically shuts down the conversation, right? And then other feelings associated with more of the white experience of these conversations are guilt or fear, the main one being fear of being accused or blamed or being labeled a racist. So that sort of segues into this next step, which is avoidance strategies. This is something that sort of naturally is produced by these emotions, so Sue argues. So white people's fear of appearing biased or racist leads to self-censorship or just being silent, or political correct or colorblind language. And so what he calls these avoidance maneuvers, which leads whites to present an inauthentic self. And so he suggests that the effect is the exact opposite of intended, and that this makes people of color feel like the white people that are being quiet or using this coded language are in fact more biased and more prejudiced, not less, for having done so. On the flip side, people of color encounter resistance or are punished for bringing up race, and this, sort of, to me, conjured up Du Bois' idea of the double bind, where, and this is Sue's language, where people of color must walk a tightrope between being true to oneself and at the same time not risk offending others in a way that has higher stakes than the white participants in this conversation. What he suggests is that successful race talk is crucial for increasing what he calls racial literacy, which he basically describes as the ability to critically analyze racial ideologies, dispel stereotypes, and misinformation about other groups. So I feel like I'm already probably pretty behind, so I'm just going to move on. So what he did in his interviews with people and in these focus groups is try and come up with a list of key characteristics of race talk in the classroom. And what he's ultimately trying to do by picking out these characteristics is that they're interpreted and experienced differently by people in the room based on their racial identities. So there's an overall disinclination to participate, but the motivations for that are different. There are these, heightened, powerful, and uncomfortable emotions, but as I was just talking about, those are different. People feel like their perspectives or worldviews or lived experience are being challenged or invalidated. Discussion becomes more uncomfortable. Efforts to dilute, diminish, change, mystify, or terminate the topic sort of is a recurring outcome of these unsuccessful conversations about race. Then he goes on to characterize those strategies of shutting down the conversation as experienced as microaggressions by people of color in these conversations. And he suggests that white faculty in these conversations in the classroom are colluding with the white students in the room by shutting down the conversation when it gets too heated. So then he kind of tries to walk through what he calls the norms of race talk, or the rules that are governing how race, the subliminal or hidden rules that govern how race talk can be conducted. And so the first of these is what he calls the politeness protocol, in which race talk in general gets characterized as being improper or impolite or too divisive and better to just be left alone. So this is sort of a functioning of a taboo. And that initiating race talks risks being socially isolated because race talk is contrary to so many societal, situational social norms. I think what's most interesting for us is what he calls the academic protocol, in which he argues that race talk is discouraged in the classroom because of a general characterization of academic inquiry as objective, detached, and rational. Empirical reality is valued over experiential reality. And on that, he actually cites Bell Hooks, who we read last year in our group. He stresses the mind-body dualism in the Western tradition, in which the mind is elevated over the body, and emotions are understood as antagonistic to reason. So for people of color, race talk is about bearing witness, but in the academy, personal and collective experiences or anecdotal material get reduced to opinions and are not considered a legitimate form of data. And then he goes through what he calls the colorblind protocol, which is where he sort of fleshes out the debilitating role of the aspirations for a colorblind society, and that clearly is not, in fact, our current state of affairs. And then he what he calls strategic colorblindness on the part of white participants in race talk, which is these patterns of behavior to appear unbiased, friendly, and pretend not to see a person's race. And then he cites a bunch of psychological studies that show that the pretense of not seeing color, quote, lowers empathetic ability, dims perceptual awareness, maintains false illusions, and allow whites to live in a world of false deception. Pretty bleak. And this theme of self-deception among white participants trying to engage in race talk is recurring throughout the book. So I just wanted to read a longer quote that he had on the academic protocol, and I'll just read it as you read along. Emotions such as anger and frustration, for example, are disruptive to Western European classroom decorum, where calm discussions filled with logic and reasoning are philosophically aspects of appropriate student and faculty behavior. Classrooms are political spaces, microcosms of race relations in the broader society, and teachers represent the agents that enforce the types of interactions dictated by the norms of the learning environment. Okay, so he has a long middle section in the book that's really trying to unpack why white faculty members shut down conversations about race. He identifies 4 types of what he calls intersecting layers of fear that lead white faculty to terminate racial dialogues. First and foremost is that fear of appearing racist, a fear of realizing their own racism, racial biases, stereotypes that they hold, confronting those, fear of confronting white privilege, and fear of taking personal responsibility for ending racism. And so from that, he goes into a longer explanation of what exactly is happening in the discourse of colorblindness. And so he sort of lists these as denying the racialized experiences of people of color, denying the existence of the privileges and advantages enjoyed by whites, perpetuates a myth of meritocracy, it masks or makes invisible structural inequality, it sustains social hierarchy by providing a cover of innocence, and finally justifies inaction in trying to combat racial inequalities based on power and privilege. And there was another nice quote from him on this, so I'll just read that as well. Race talk is frightening because it threatens to destroy the fabric of naivete and innocence that has shielded many from acknowledging their continuing roles as unintentional oppressors in a cultural context that is inherently unfair to people of color. It allows colorblind individuals to escape responsibility for taking action, to end injustice, unfairness, and racism in our society. And so then the next section of the book is sort of trying to work out exactly what white privilege is and how it gets encountered or obfuscated in most situations of race talk. He suggests that the invisibility of whiteness and colorblindness are two sides of the same coin. That the luxury of refusing identification with whiteness that happens in colorblindness is itself a part of white privilege. And he also cites a number of studies that while many white people accept that people of color experience life as second-class citizens, that realization does not typically translate into an acknowledgement that white people are therefore necessarily advantaged and effectively benefit from racism. And that confronting the reality of white supremacy and white privilege is work, and it's hard, and it takes a cognitive and emotional toll on the folks that try. He gets into white supremacy a bit, and I wanted to say some things about that, but maybe I'll save it for later since I'm already at 13 minutes. But if it doesn't naturally come back up in the conversation, remind me to say something else about that. So he makes this interesting argument that while condemning racism is socially acceptable, doing something about it is not. And so this is something that a lot of critical race theorists make a distinction between anti-racialism, which is a rejection of racial categories and whatever, and anti-racism, which is taking actions to fight racial inequality, and that those two things often get conflated, but in fact they are often at cross purposes. And so I wanted to take a minute to read this very long vignette that came from one of the chapters, because I thought it was like a really nice metaphor for sort of visualizing and concretizing that idea and how difficult it is to actually be anti-racist. So, I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racists ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go in the same direction as the white supremacists. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others. So from there, he goes into focusing on two personal transformations that would make race talk easier. One is developing a non-racist identity, which for whites, according to Sue, means developing a white racial identity, effectively owning privilege and your own biases, and then taking that next step to become anti-racist, which he identifies as sort of beginning with breaking the silence on racism. So the last two chapters of the book, which is about 250 pages, are actually the only place where he gives any concrete strategies for how to go about achieving successful race talk. And he identifies 11 for teachers and facilitators or other trainers. So the first is understand your own racial or cultural identity, and so that's making visible the invisible. Doing that allows facilitators to anticipate how their race will impact racial dialogues in their classrooms. The second is to acknowledge and be open about one's own racial biases. And he makes the point, which is kind of obvious, that teachers and facilitators are also products of the same social conditioning that upholds the racial order. They inevitably inherit biases, fears, stereotypes of society, and what he urges educators and facilitators to do is to model truthfulness for the other participants in the conversation, and empower others to take risks by acknowledging those biases. The third is to be comfortable, and that's key because students can sense when you're not comfortable, and they'll pick up on that, and that will end up sort of reorienting the dynamic of the conversation. Working to understand the meaning of emotions. So he suggests that you need to be able to deconstruct the symbolic meaning of different emotions that are at play in race talk. So for our purposes, guilt, anger, defensiveness, being turned off, a sense of helplessness, or being afraid. And so what he says, if these are the feelings that you're experiencing as you're trying to facilitate a dialogue about race, that you have to acknowledge them and embrace them and make that part of the conversation. So fifth is validate and facilitate discussion of feelings. He suggests that the primary goal of race talk is to create conditions that make expression of feelings valid and legitimate, precisely against what he calls the academic protocol. So controlling the process, not the content of race talk. And he argues that there's a hidden level of the conversation where the true dialogue is taking place. So that it's not necessarily in the content of the words, but it's in the nature of the dynamics that you know, the sort of racial issues are actually playing out. He gives the example of a woman in one of these anti-racism workshops that protested that, you know, women are oppressed too and what have you, and the way that he responded to that, and maybe we'll get into that in the discussion, but what he says is that underlying that interaction, there's a hidden transcript that generates those statements. So we'll come back to that. So working on unmasking the difficulty of the dialogue through process observation. So using that kind of encounter as a teaching moment to say, okay, well, where did that question come from? Let's think about why you had that response. I'm so close to done. So not allowing difficult dialogues to be brewed in silence. Often in the classroom you'll sort of hit an impasse. You won't necessarily be able to get out of it in that same session, so it's so crucial to provide a framework to revisit it and continue to talk it through as a group, because leaving one's on their own to deal with it, you know, can have the opposite effect. Understanding differences in communication styles. I think Maddie's going to talk about that a little bit, so I'll just leave that there for a second. The most important I found was the idea of forewarning, planning, and purposefully integrating race talk into your classroom discussions so that, you know, it's deliberate what you're doing. For classes on race, you know, that could include an explicit statement addressing the difficulty of the conversations that you're going to have in the class, and that's all sort of, you know, meant to highlight, you know, courage, risk, and vulnerability are the key sort of themes that are going to be running through those conversations. And he suggests that for classes not on race, you can design assignments and activities that place students in situations that expose them to events that question their racial identity, so sort of pursuing a more indirect approach. And finally, validate, encourage, and express admiration to students who speak when it is unsafe to do so. And that, I think, sort of speaks for itself. So I think I'm going to stop. I'm just going to leave this slide up there. He has a very schematic, detailed rubric here for how to become an anti-racist. I'll just leave it there for us to come back to later in the discussion. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So it's a lot. It is. Not just because the topic is a lot, but he's very detailed, he's very thorough. I can tell he's like really passionate and has been doing this for years. Just kind of a couple of things about the book that I found critique worthy was that it was repetitive, and a lot of the same stuff came up in every chapter, sometimes multiple times in the chapter. But I think that's a great point for, you know, if you're teaching the book. Most people don't teach an entire book of this nature. So, and I did find the vignettes to be, and the questions that come along with it, to be very useful for my thoughts about how am I going to do this work moving forward? How would I design a course? What would I include in discussions? And so kind of pulling that together for me was really important because I felt like as a person of color, a lot of the stuff he was saying was not new. So it wasn't only repetitive because the words were literally repetitive, but I was like, yeah, I know. I know so hard. And so, you know, but that also, you know, I had to kind of check myself around that because it's, you know, easy to not be faithful to the work when you come into it with this experience, right? And I had to both validate myself, but also validate the fact that there are other people experiencing lots of other things as I'm trying to process all of my stuff and teach them about their stuff and learn about their stuff. And so that gave me this question of like, how do you teach what you know and live and be earnest and honest about it without making assumptions about what people know, making sure that you make clear what it is you know, what you live and experience, and also owning your own biases, right? As a Black woman, I am hella biased, right? And I acknowledge that, and you know, and it's not just a matter of, okay, I'm biased too, and let's all be biased together. But it's saying, you know, when I walk into a certain situation, my flags go up. And it's not necessarily just because I know the situation's unsafe, but I go in, I'm like, okay, I know I'm gonna be surrounded by a bunch of white people, and am I ready for this right now? And I have to think about that because, as the book says, like, we know we're walking into these situations, and there's a lot of stuff that we have to expect for survival across the history of our existence in this country, right? What am I doing with that is the issue. Right? And as I think about being an instructor, as I think about being a social worker, what does that mean for me and how I navigate things? And so there's a lot of pain that I carry with that I have to own and work with. And so it's still work, even though I may not feel a guilt about what's happened to folks, right? Or I may not feel the same sort of hesitation, because I'll talk to you about race and queerness and being a woman all day long. We can talk about this. But it is tiring and it's frustrating, right? And how do I feel about that and how do I react to that? And so, but a lot of what you talked about seemed commonsensical, like this stuff. And some of the strategies, like, yes, if you're white, you should get to know people of color so that you're not afraid of us. I think that would be a really good idea. You know, that kind of thing. But, you know, having to think about, well, what does that mean for someone who's never had to think about that? And how do I convey that to this person? And so I started thinking about it as a social work instructor, right? I've been trained as a clinician. I've been teaching social worky things, everybody said, since I was a little kid. And so a lot of this stuff just kind of comes to me, but then when you think about putting that in the classroom, what does that mean? I was telling some folks the other day, I do think of classrooms as clinical groups. And so for those who may not know, basically what's happening is you're processing a lot of feelings, you're processing a lot of fear, especially when you come to class, you come to learn, right? Nobody wants to be that person who raises their hand and asks the stupid question. What is a stupid question really? Nobody wants to ask the offensive question or say the wrong word or something like that. So how do I help create a space in my classroom that people can say, okay, you know what? I don't know anything, and I know that my inquiry is gonna piss somebody off, but I need to ask. How, you know, and how can we as a community in our classroom hold that person and say, okay, here's what's problematic with your question, but we also understand why you have that question, and be able to, you know, to use all of the emotion in the room, which is something, you know, Sue talked about all the time. The fact that people don't want to feel icky, right? Well, I'm a clinician. I deal with icky feelings that's my profession. So how am I going to work that into my my instruction? And if I am teaching about policy, you know, people are going to be concerned about what policy means for their lives and for other lives, and how do we address the institutional racism in the policies that we're talking about. or the way, what is evidence-based practice and why is your cognitive behavioral therapy set up the way that it is and doesn't acknowledge the way that you think as a person coming from X culture, right? And what does it mean that you have to go through this because your insurance said so, you know? So it got me thinking about anti-oppressive social work, which there are books about it. One of my favorites is edited by Donna Baines, and the closing remarks by Akua Benjamin. Most of it's Canadian social workers, which says a lot about American social work, but that's another conversation. But, you know, Sue talked about issues of white supremacy and just our situations, right? You know, if you think about kind of extrapolating this to K-12, most of the teachers are white in urban public school systems, but your students are not. And what does that mean? You know, when you think about who the college instructors are, but we have all these initiatives to get people of color in the classroom and this academic protocol and that kind of stuff. What can we talk about? What can we deal with? And so she talks about as a clinician in whatever kind of situation you're in, how do we counter the same sort of white supremacy? So I've been making those kind of connections. But she also talks about this fear of addressing inequities, right? And as social workers, we're supposed to do that. We don't. But she says, just as fear is systemic, so is silence. Silence is valued under the guise of politeness in our society. It is a way to avoid conflict or unpleasantness. A great value, politeness. Many argue that it is what is at the bottom of respect. However, silence also operates as a norm that allows us not to resist. The only way to address fear is to carefully and thoughtfully face the issues generating the problems. And so I think that's kind of the background, the recurring theme here. And I think about that in terms of academic protocol that says, you know what, the stuff that you feel is not relevant in our classroom, so you have to be silent about it. Well, what if your academic goal is to address that stuff that you're supposed to be silent about? How do you deal with that paradox? And so I think I will stop rambling at that point so we can talk more about it.
And I wish we could, well, okay, thank you, Madam Michelle. I guess now I'm supposed to say my bit, but I really hope that people are starting to develop questions and interventions of their own at this point, because it'll be fun to hear what thoughts this conversation is triggering, especially for people who haven't read the book. I'll just say that this was an interesting book for me to read, and it did bring up icky feelings, not the ones I was expecting, or because it was normally, you know, I read a book and I kind of disappear, and this book didn't let me do that. It made me instead kind of, you know, second guess myself, which is an icky feeling. So it made me very self-conscious about, among other things, my communication style. And so part way, I looked up, you know, in the middle of a sentence, I'm going to tell you what the sentence was in just a little bit, and I said to myself, no, that can't be true. And then a few seconds later, I was like, no, wait a second. What if I'm, you know, doing that same thing that the book is talking about by denying, you know, what Derald Wing Sue is asserting is the case? What if I'm denying racial realities by contradicting him in my head? But so here, let me now read you the thing that I have read, and let me get a sense of what you guys think about this. White styles of communication are in marked contrast to the conversation conventions of most Black Americans. Whites believe that the discussions should be devoid of affect, that is, racial discussions, apparently all discussions. That one serves as a, quote, spokesperson, that is, truth resides in the idea and not as an advocate. And that the debate should be objective, detached, and reasoned. And to support this, Sue cites a study from Irvine in York, 1995, an article on cultural differences in learning styles, which I haven't looked at. But anyway, he goes on about this at length, and he talks not only about the communication styles of Black Americans and white Americans, but about Asian Americans and Latinos. And he says that any conversation, whether it's race talk or otherwise, needs to take these differences into consideration. And you know, I was with him until he just started describing white styles of communication, and I looked up and I said, what? That just doesn't sound like me or most of the people in my life, the majority of whom are white. I don't know who he's talking about. It sounds like white men on television. That doesn't sound like the people in my world. But so I just wanted to start out by signaling that I enjoyed reading this book, and I learned a lot from it, but that I have some reservations about the way it frames conversation styles and the way it frames the problem of race talk. And so at the same time, while I'm sharing my reservations with you, and trying to invite us all to think about other ways we might frame the problem, what the book did do was open my eyes to just how little access I have to the whole picture. There's my racial reality, there's your racial reality, there's a shared social reality that we all have to reckon with, and I realized reading this book that, you know, I can't do it by myself. Like, these race talks are a condition for gaining access to the kind of information about the world that we all need to make sense of this reality. Anyway, this book definitely, if it did nothing else, it taught me, it brought that home to me in a very major way. But so following up on what Amanda Michelle was saying about the way the book kind of stresses the role of, you know, the person of color as the minority in most groups, and the kind of burden of expertise that places on them. There's a kind of flip side of that this book also brought out, and that I want to share with you, which is the flip side of, you know, the person of color as expert is the white person as the ignorant one. And this book really brings that kind of profile into relief. So for example, in his chapter, Why is Race Talk So Difficult and Uncomfortable?, Sue reports that there's just a simple ignorance, a straightforward, or is experienced by these people as straightforward ignorance of what is happening in the classroom when a racially offensive thing is said. So the way he described it, both white professors and white students were unable, he writes, to clearly identify and deconstruct racial microaggressions that take place in classrooms. This is based on like his aggregation of some data from some other studies, and his own observations as well. They seemed oblivious to offensive microaggressive conduct in themselves and others, although they could sense the tension in the room and they knew something was wrong. Unlike peoples of color, who could readily name and identify the offensive behavior, the white informants had great difficulty recognizing them. This was true, he says, for both white students and white professors, although the latter felt, you'll be glad to know, greater responsibility for pursuing and clarifying the topic. So what we get from this is that white instructors know something is up, but they don't know what's up. And you know, this is where the matter kind of stands. That's where it sits. And so you can understand, you know, based on that, you know, why it is that so many of these conversations get shut down. But a deeper level of problem, make sure I don't go on too long either, is that these talks so often are are prompted by microaggressions. The conversation never comes up. Race talk doesn't take place in classrooms except on the occasion of someone's racial blunder or you know, these hot moments where the temperature is already raised. And so that got me thinking that that actually is really the kind of crux of the problem. And I think that this is something that Sue gets to toward the very end of his book when he's trying to lay out what the solution is. But I just want to kind of amplify this point and see if you guys have any thoughts about it. The problem then becomes, how to initiate race talk in without a racial blunder to precipitate it. How do you get it on the floor, and how do you motivate that discussion for all of your students when there are so many understandable once you try to understand them, sort of impediments to that conversation coming from both white students and students of color. There's so much at stake for everyone in these conversations, and yet they're so necessary both emotionally and intellectually to the work we do. But how do you initiate and then sustain those conversations differently than has been the norm? And this is really where I run into a kind of, not a total imaginative brick wall, but kind of just because I have not seen it done in my own experience as a student, or I've seen it done with tremendous infrequency. I feel like we're kind of inventing some kind of the wheel here. And I know it's been invented, but I don't yet understand how it rolls. And so that's why I need to hear from you guys. I'll end it there.
Okay, well, I'll keep these comments very, very brief, but, I think something that's, well, Amanda Michelle, your first point, I think, really points to the question of audience. I mean, who is this book written for? And I would say that it is definitely, it struck me as written very much for white people. So I'm not at all surprised that you're like, oh yeah, of course. And that sort of gets to what Maddie was just talking about, how, Sue points to centuries of survival strategies that, have heightened the perception of people of color to be sensitive and identify threat or danger, or how these dynamics are actually playing out. And I referenced Boys and what he writes about second sight. I feel like this whole book could have been a little more pleasant to read if you got a little more sophisticated theoretical reflections on these questions. But yeah, so this idea of this heightened perceptual awareness. So you don't need to read this book because you're already perceiving these dynamics. I mean, but ultimately that's sort of like what he said. I mean, on some level, like I think that sort of connects what you both were saying. I think that I have lots of other responses to what you guys just said, but I think it would be great to just open it up right away, and then we can come back to them. If you could just introduce yourself before you make a comment, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Ansela Shore. I'm a Harper and Schmidt Fellow at the university. I teach the core classes.
And former
Do
coordinator
research.
of our group.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
one of the founders of this group, as you noted.
Thanks. All right. So I will start off by saying I don't like psychological treatments of this problem of race, and precisely for the sort of dynamic that they set up where people of color are all knowing and white people are ignorant. So it's like that whole idea that when something is like everybody senses that something is wrong, right? The instructor senses it was wrong, and then the people of color know what it is. And the white students in the class don't know, they're completely ignorant. It's ridiculous, right? Like that sense that something is wrong is what is making everybody uncomfortable. Like there might be disagreement about what that wrong thing is. The white person who may have made the transgression or is not sort of like privy to thinking about things along racial lines may feel the scorn of other people. I mean, because faces are being made, like, or people are like, or people disengaged or look off. Like, they're cues that we give each other to sort of denote how we feel in a room. You sense that, and the person of color might have a sense about what that is, but it might not be right. It might be wrong-headed. It might not be something that we want to see sort of realized in a democratic world. Like, so this idea, so even sort of framing discussion in that way, to me, is utterly ridiculous. I have strong opinions. And then also, like, this distinct, like, feeling, inequality of feeling. It's like he sort of, I didn't read the book, so I'm going off of your description, but it seems as if, too, like, he's talking about how people don't care about feelings when they talk about these issues, right? Or they want to have these sort of academic conversations to then shut down sort of views that may challenge like the mainstream narratives, right? Yet when you see headway being made in challenging the mainstream narratives, then there is an emotional outburst that everybody pays attention to. So there's an inequality in the emotions that we pay attention to. And this book seems to me to validate that. Even though, like, he's talking about being anti-racist, like, he's talking about making an anti-racist identity. You know, you have to walk, fast along the conveyor belt the opposite way. But, I mean, to me, one demonstrates who they are through their actions, not by kind of like how they feel or who they feel themselves to be inside themselves, right? And so, like, that fear of revealing who you are. You might reveal yourself to be a raving racist, okay, right? But then what does that mean about who you are? And then what can be done in the future, right? Like, or if one might want to put something out there and people totally disagree and you get that back and you start to, think about what you said, or you might sort of think about, oh, that action is not okay. I can't do that anymore because it's sanctioned. Like, I think that those are the sorts of things that we need to think about, like, our response to each other, our actions, like who's held responsible for what and whatever. This talk about feeling, like the way he's talking about, he's constructing feelings, the way he's sort of setting up the distinction between who knows and who doesn't know, to me just seems to reproduce the problem in way, like he's diagnosing a problem in a very interesting way, right? But then the way that he's sort of calling us to get out of it is reproducing that problem, right? By validating the very thing that he's saying is getting us in this bind, it seems to me. Like, so, I'll shut up.
Can we, okay, yeah, okay, I want to come back to that, but.
Go ahead.
Kind of backtracking about what this woman had said.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Erica. One of the things, I'm a Chicago native, born and raised, so when I talk about race here, it looks very different than what I would talk to with my students in rural Washington State, who I am the first person of color they see, and the first person of color they see in a position of authority. And when I internalize that, recognizing my private school education, right, which is Miss Class, the role of class, I'm...
Please, sir, no! Talking about class is derailing.
Yeah, George Derald is here.
Go ahead.
Okay, like, because my racialized identity is comforted by my class privilege. So getting to that place as a teacher allowed me to reintroduce myself to how to have that conversation, right? Because a rural white student who doesn't know, who's never seen a person of color, they're learning Santa Claus doesn't exist. And so, yeah, and what's also interesting to me is he's doing with social relations what Victor V and whoever does with discourse in terms of, like when you were talking about whites speak about it one way, speak one way, etc. Villanueva does that to articulate the different ways people of color think but in their writing. So it's interesting. I'm looking forward to doing a comparative analysis later in my life. But yeah.
After here.
Let's just get maybe a couple more and then talk some more.
I just wanted to ask what is that serious statement, talking about classes derailing? And if so, why do you say that?
So he says that in the book, that bringing up, if you're talking about race, like this woman bringing up gender or somebody bringing up class, that always happens, right? This is not just about race. Race isn't an issue because slavery ended a whole 150 years ago. Yesterday, so it's he's saying these are the things that people bring up. And what about the Italians? What about the Irish? Like these people also experience stuff. So these are all little things that people bring up when we're talking about that content versus process issue. That's why I said that. So that was my, the book lacks intersectionality in the nature, right? We were talking about that
The other thing is
earlier.
he never raises the possibility that a non-white person would bring up gender, I guess, related to intersectionality.
Yeah, or
It's
sexuality.
always the white person who's derailing the conversation who brings in any issue.
Yeah, because we don't have any black people who deny the existence of racism. Dominant says
You follow up?
it. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I'm just worried that don't know, if there is such a thing as pure race talk, that like you're ever in a situation where that class and sexuality and gender are not on people's minds and influencing the way they're talking about race. Especially if someone says race doesn't matter, or not even necessarily race doesn't matter, but like why are we only talking about race when like class is such a big deal for me or something? And then like maybe they won't even say that. Maybe all they say is, why are we talking so much about race? But that could be there, you know. And so, but I also think that just talking about race purely could reify stereotypes about race and could also like just distinguish any differences among races and people's experience.
So, yeah, about that, I think that's a part of what Ainsley was saying, right? I mean, so let me just make sure. So you were saying you don't like this social psychological approach to the question of race talk because maybe could you say more about what you mean? Because I think I agree with you, but I want to make sure.
So, and one thing that I wanted to add is that, like, there's scholarship about race, right?
Yeah.
Like, why are we constructing, like, individuals who have this lived experience as, like, the people who have all this racial knowledge, right? You look at Black Skin, White Mask, the 5th chapter, when Fanon is talking about his lived experience. You know why it's so fantastic? Because he's a psychoanalyst, and he's also dealing with phenomenology. So he's engaged with a philosophical many philosophical traditions, and that is impacting. And he's thinking about his society, and he has, like these experiences that then he's thinking about, right? And when you bring in Du Bois, the lived experience of the Black, he's done all these rich sociological studies, right? To think about the world that he's in, right? He is in the knowledge production business. So, like, to even frame this as, like, I'm knowledgeable by feature of my skin, of my lived experience, as if lived experience in and of itself produces things that all of us would want to learn from. Sometimes it produces ridiculousness, right? And so, like, so, I mean, it's like you devoid the world of the resources we have.
So you're trying to say that it's a false dichotomy?
Yes.
Well, this mind.
I think though that is something that I was struggling with, and I'm glad it's been articulated because I was telling them about how I wish I had another week to choose. I wanted to put together a whole one-pager, and I was being really, really ambitious about this. But I get it because I do think that people have feelings and it's gross and oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? And we're all, people of color, but don't be the only brown person in the room when something comes up, right? All eyes are on you. But I felt like there was something more that I wasn't quite getting, and it didn't all, because so much else is going on, it didn't all come to me. But I think this comes up with that issue, what I was talking about amongst the three of us. He uses the word unintentional a lot in reference to white people and their blunders, right? And so when the white person unintentionally says something racist, or when the white person unintentionally navigates in a way that oppresses other people, or, and it sounded to me, as a slightly jaded person of color, that white people never mean wrong. And I was like, I'm from Savannah. I know this book is not written for the card-carrying KKK member, but I'm thinking about that chick in my building that I just moved into the other week who literally held up my exit because she was concerned about the fact that I was in the building. And I was like, well, clearly I belong here, so I got in, and I'm on my way out. But to get interrogated by some woman who's not saying, wow, you're Black, you don't belong here, but everything about that interaction was, hey, you're Black, what are you doing here? I can't say that she did not intentionally mean to be racist in that situation, but I don't know that she was cognizant of the way she was enacting her racism. And so what do you do with that? And you can't just be like, oh, the white person doesn't know anything about what they're doing, and it's you who receive all of them. Like, no, you knew exactly what you were doing. So how, there's not really any room to account for that sort of thing. in there. And so, I mean, I think it's just kind of tacking on to what you were saying.
But so also, there's the setting up academic protocol as the enemy of productive race talk, I think is a big problem. I mean, it's especially a problem for us because academic protocol is our business, right? But also, I mean, changing academic protocol. But to reject, to say that, we're gonna have to transcend the mind-body dichotomy in order to have a productive conversation about race, I just, that generated some resistance from me. But one of the things that I think is valuable here, even if I don't like the full conclusion he brings it to, is the fact that that feelings are a kind of fact in the classroom, and that they are social facts that do so often just inhibit the conversation, and that they have to be reckoned with. I mean, it's tangential to, or sort of a parallel problem to the kind of, we don't need to go, it's a triggering conversation, and so it just doesn't get had when it absolutely needs to get had. But the idea, what he doesn't kind of ever get to is, let's say you get to the point where race talk no longer makes you a stuttering, inarticulate person, which he has a really interesting section about. I loved his discussion, and this is where I really like social psychology, where they go in and they find, they listen to people in race talk, and they find that so many people, especially white people, literally become less articulate. They mutter, they stumble over words, they become speechless. They can't talk. They can't, psychologically and even physically, cannot engage in race talk. So that's a problem. But let's say you can get past that problem. Then what? Let's say we can all have a conversation, just hypothetically, about race. What do we say? That's the part that I feel
the content is not there at all. This is all about process. But I mean, would you actually argue that what he's calling academic protocol is not inhibiting to race conversations in this institution in particular? I have experienced that in my classes where my students appreciate a conversation about, and I teach about race, so it's different. But where the students will appreciate having a sort of sidebar about sort of what's going on in our community last year during all the events or whatever, or what's going on in the country, or whatever level you want to talk about it. They appreciate it. We have a successful conversation, and at the end of the term, half of them feel like that was interesting, but it didn't really belong in the classroom. I mean, that's something that we create and produce here in this institution and in many institutions around the country.
Well, and I think it's very real. I agree. I'm on both sides of it because, I mean, I'm at SSA, right? School of Social Service Administration. We had a whole blow up. Our master's students, our entire 200, we have lots of signatures on a petition that was generated by master's students who were like, you know what, this accreditation thing that you have, you're not meeting it, and we're going to tell on you. Because we don't talk about race in the classroom as social workers. Because we don't talk about gender and sexuality. And when we have that week that those readings come up, everybody looks down and to the left. To the left. To the left. And so, this idea of that, it is not, the professor knows that if they push the issue, it's going to make people uncomfortable, and that's not what they're here for, and we only have 10 weeks. And the students are not sure what to do about it, and, whether they're white and don't want to seem offensive or racist, or are afraid of uncovering their own stuff, or they're black and they're tired, or they're Latino, or they're Asian, and nobody even thinks about us. This was all about, so it just doesn't happen, and then you get this whole politeness idea where if I call you out, you might give me a bad grade. That intersects with this academic protocol, and so now we have this huge situation going on, and so I think. Then we think about what's happening with people's existence and, the fact that students felt the need to bring the university called the university to task by, you know, kind of falsifying a hate incident. But the fact that there are actual hate incidents that made that seem so very real.
That's right.
No, that was the incident that we talked about.
Yeah.
That was the
That's a
incident.
disaster.
Yeah, it was. And so, you know, and the fact that the university shut down when white people were threatened to be killed, but the girl whose face was put out on the internet and her life was threatened for reporting sexual assault, she has no protection, virtually no protection, right? And so that dichotomy, I think it intersects with a lot of stuff, but we are an academic institution. You know, when things come up, there's no space in our curriculum, you know, to say, okay, so we're gonna talk about this week's current events and what that has to do with, you know, everybody's existence and all that sort of thing. And so we're focused on these things here in this box.
We have a hand there, and we have a hand here, and let's get one, we can get a little bit of a stack going. Okay.
Hi, I'm Samantha Burke. I'm actually a student at Columbia College in Cultural Studies and Journalism. And I think when we talk about academic protocol, instantly I always go back to, I think, what we're not really talking about because it's not necessarily relevant to where we're teaching or who we're taught by.
Right.
And so when I think about academic protocol, I immediately think of the elementary, fundamental growth for these children in these minds, because we talk about how we're going to talk about race and how we're going to engage in conversation and how we kind of make that a part of the academic protocol. But then I'm thinking, you know, when did we learn to view race? And how do we do that? And how is that part of academic protocol? I mean, truthfully, the first time I ever knew black in my predominantly white elementary school in Naperville, Illinois, you guys know this from Chicago, so keep in mind. At Owen Elementary School was when we talked about slavery, and we learned it was wrong, and that was probably the initial thought, but we still learned that black was inferior, and black was submission, and black was this, and black was this, and it's already ingrained immediately, you know. But beforehand, when I had learned white, it wasn't white until there was black, and when I learned white, it was forefathers, and Christopher Columbus was somehow not a genocidal maniac, and he was a hero, and somehow when I learned white, it was colonization as far as like powers and the Renaissance, and it was glamorized and romanticized and beautiful, but I never learned about African royalty, and I never learned about how Haiti came to be, and how France was involved in, I don't know, in shaping any black and then also further on when I was in middle school, and American literature to me was white. You know, never did I think for a moment that reading, you know, an essay of a slave was literature, because to me it was F. Scott Fitzgerald, and it was, you know, and Hemingway, and it was all those white writers, and so I think that like diversifying the content just as important, Erica, as diversifying the authority and the people in the authority and the cast, you know, the cast members of the school and of the institution of school. I think that it's critical.
Does talk about that, to be fair. He talks about, you know, how kids start to perceive that, hey, your skin is brown at around 3 or 4 if they see people with brown skin, right? And he talks about this idea, you know, that our education system is set up to make white the default and the glorious default and all of that stuff. And there's not, maybe that's a different book that, you know, we should be looking at next. But, you know, what about changing the curriculum? So I'm glad you made that point.
Hi, I'm Laura with the Graduate Program in Health Administration and Policy. And I loved the racial pedagogy work group discussion, so I really encourage all of you guys to join in and just to make another pitch for checking out their website and the listserv so that you can hear more about the activities. One of the conversations that we had in one of the discussions had related to this academic protocol issue, and you know, the group was coming to consensus that it would really be important for all instructors to take a critical look at their own syllabi, their, you know, the body of knowledge that they teach, the body of knowledge that they got their PhDs in, and look at it from the critical race perspective. just, everybody should now, relook and figure out what that kind of like white framing dialogue is that they've been perpetuating year after year. And I really think that's a great challenge to faculty, and we should all take that on as a responsibility and then incorporate what we learn into the new curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that the group is trying to do is sort of, think about inclusive teaching, inclusion in the classroom, and developing concrete inclusive teaching strategies for folks, for anybody that's interested. And one of the things that, came out of that discussion was just the sense that it's your responsibility as a teacher to know the structural inequalities in your discipline, in the community that you're teaching in the institution, and that if you don't pay attention to that and actively do something to change it, then you'll just reproduce those structures. I mean, it's pretty basic. Yeah. Was there another question?
You, was there a hand?
Yeah.
I'm gonna raise my hand. Alyssa, doctoral student, candidate at UIC in sociology. I have an interesting perspective. So I did my maths here. When I went to UIC, student bodies are completely different. I was like, I'm in heaven! Sorry. But having said that, right, it's a privilege to work with working class students because I can say, yes, tell me your story, right? And tell me your story and how do I engage? One of the things I think about in terms of how we're trained as scholars here versus what I'm able to do there, like how do we literally close the gap in curriculum development, right? Because I think about like in terms of inclusive teaching, and here, how do we teach students at USC like close the book, don't read the book.
Right.
Like that's what right now. I don't need excuse language intellectual masturbation for like let's like not intellectually masturbate today and like get into how you see the world, right? And I think about exercises that I've used in classes I've taught where it's deconstructing social location and think about how it informs how you read, right? And I wonder to what extent we could increase exercises like that in classrooms here. Because I think about how, even from a scholarly perspective, like being able to, I'm trying to think, there was a seminar I taught at UIC where there's a collection of case studies on Latinos, and I did pick certain chapters from certain books on purpose so that students would be like, oh wait, that sounds like Pilsen, or that sounds like Come Apart, or that sounds like, I was like, you almost think I did it on purpose, right? Like, maybe there's some logic to something. So just thinking about how we as scholars and instructors can think about the social location of our students and how it shapes the curriculum, and two, how do we teach students, especially in a place like this, right? Students who are so used to being like name drop or concept drop or do the history of the field in 5 minutes because you're that brilliant, right? Like how do we deconstruct that process and teach them to bridge that conceptual work with that self-work, right? I think that's part of the process, and I think that's one of the things this place has lost. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
My name?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Will Towns. I'm in the Office of Civic Engagement here at the university and a PhD student at Benedictine studying organizational development. One of the things that I'm researching is really how does the structure of higher education institutions impede itself from changing. And what I'm seeing and hearing even is that if we're looking at trying to label a department or a person to solve the problem, then we're in real trouble, right? So they name a chief diversity officer, wipe their hands and sort of walk away, when in fact a true sort of diversity initiative seeps all the way through faculty, curriculum, student body, mix, and those sorts of things. And until we can get to a point where that is really what we're looking at, sort of systematic change, we continue to sort of have these sort of band-aids. I look at it like the sustainability department. Everyone has one because you got to be green. No one knows really what they do besides sort paper. Right? But it goes far beyond sort of that. And in these talks of race, I think we also have to push so that people are uncomfortable, right? So I went to some of the whitest institutions on the planet, Notre Dame, Wisconsin, Madison, some of those places. And it was, somewhat, I wrote a paper on why we should eliminate Black history. only black person in the class, no questions, right? No one's going to challenge that sort of topic. But you have to sort of see them squirm and sort of push them, and it was sort of a twist on why. I was really saying we should, but kind of twisting it. But you need someone to sort of push them, and it's not my responsibility to make the classroom comfortable, right? As a student, I'm pushing people to engage and get in the discussion, to really sort of understand and comprehend what the issues are. We do suffer from, many minorities, from a cultural taxation, that we carry an extra burden to explain things, and you get somewhat frustrated, when people say, well, if they don't like the neighborhood and the schools, they should go somewhere else, and you're like, well, it's not that easy, and so you got to explain this stuff. But to really push and challenge and not let the things sort of slide, I think is part of the problem. But it's also a burden, right? So you could have stopped the woman in the hall, say that was really offensive, do you realize what you're doing? But you got stuff to do, you got to go on your day. Right. And so we can't take the time to sort of do that, but there are spots where we can really push the questions and sort of push the concerns. Why aren't we studying black and brown researchers in our studies? Or how come there's only 2 and it's the same researcher in 2 separate classes, right? So they're saying that's all we got, and that sort of thing. But I think there's a role for us, even as students and researchers, to really sort of not shy away from the conversation, but really push it. But that takes some bravery. Some people are trying to get tenure and some other things that you've got to sort of figure out. But to really sort of push them and make things uncomfortable, I think is some of the responsibility we have to have.
I'm glad you talked about that, because on one hand, I have 2 different, and I could go way down each rabbit hole, but we had this conversation about safe spaces, and Emily had this phrase she calls comfortably uncomfortable, right? And we kind of agreed on this. I don't know if any of you know, I used to be the safe space grad assistant for the Office of LGBTQ Student Life. So I was responsible for teaching the straights about how to not be rude and make life uncomfortable for us queers. And so, I'm really attached to a lot of people who came up with this, in the social justice community, who were talking about this language around triggers and safe spaces and all of this stuff. And so I, have watched it kind of devolve and then get co-opted and do all of this nasty stuff. And he talks about, Emily put the quote up there about, it's our responsibility as facilitators to, really encourage people to say things when it's unsafe. And I started thinking about what does that mean for me as a clinician, but also, as an instructor, because what is safe? And Ainsley made a really great point in our discussion. She's like, the world is not safe.
Right.
And it's like, no, it's not. No, you cannot excuse yourself from class this week because you don't like this reading. I will fail you for the week if you don't come, but you just need to understand that you're still responsible for that. And what does it mean to really be able to make it okay for people to deal with all this stuff? Now, if if there's really something that happened, we need to talk through and make sure you get counseling and all that stuff. But just because it's really unsettling and you're gonna cry, you're gonna cry a whole lot more in your years to come. It's okay. But this idea of pushing and making things uncomfortable. But what I didn't like about what Sue said and his recommendations was that white people should go and find people of color to be like their hosts.
Yeah. That was a very
I'm making faces on my iPad like.
No, but that was in contrast to
In contrast,
to just showing up at a black church. To go find out about the other, this
is why I struggled with it, because he talked about this. He gave his students an assignment to go forth and explore the other. And he is an Asian man, and so just say, he's not doing this in this like vapid land of not knowing what people of color live like, but he had this white student who went. Where did he go? Did he go to a church? I don't remember where he went.
He went to a church.
He went to a church and it was full of people of color. And he felt so uncomfortable because people were just kind of giving him like, "What are you doing here?" It was in Oakland too, so if you don't know Oakland, there's a whole lot going on in Oakland. Has been for a long time. But this white guy shows up at a church in Oakland, and having worked in Southeast DC, when white people show up, you're worried about your property taxes. You're worried about what coffee shop is gonna take place and push out your favorite little corner store, that kind of stuff, right? These are very real concerns. And so he felt that, he didn't know what was going on, and it was really a failed experiment. And so the Derald Wing Sue says, well, maybe you should have like called the pastor and said that you were interested in coming, or tried to, volunteer for a while, or tried to make some friends, join the choir. And I'm just like, A, you don't know how Black churches work. But B, like, if you just go and insert yourself, ask somebody to help you slip into the community, you'll have a much better time of slipping into the community. And I was like, I am not your mule. And I'm not gonna bring you in here. But on the other hand, how do you learn about other people if you don't interact with other people, right? And so how do you make that not a gross thing? Where you just kind of go and you're just like, I'm here to observe and learn about your people. But, and he talks, to be fair, he talked about, being in earnest, like making friends and doing things, but it still sounded like, hey, you should go make friends with these other people, so that those people aren't scary to you, as opposed to like developing really genuine because you want to just be friends with other human beings.
Okay,
There's a comment about.
no, yeah.
It's been up for.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Victoria Okaneda. I'm a grad student and PhD, so I'm mostly in those spaces. And I was interested in furthering the discussion on the challenging and safety. So obviously, not only at this institution, but at other institutions, they're more profile, talking about what does safe spaces mean. And I want to know what he's saying on that and what you guys are thinking, because I'm thinking in my place, we're at the med school, we're talking about how can we have these conversations in a useful, productive way. But though, of course, with intersectionality in your daily life, all these different issues, is there not something to question when silence might be better, might be more useful for the purpose of your institution and its missions or achieving its goal, when if you're practically tasked with the idea of training, less maybe a liberal arts focus, but training your students for these roles and these purposes, and that is very disruptive. How do you achieve these different missions, if it's going to derail, your students of color and their academic performance, or if it's going to create tension going forward when you're trying to build a team. Because these can be harmful conversations, even though challenging and making people feel has great purpose. I just wonder.
He talks about how they can be harmful conversations when they aren't done right.
Not enough time on how to do them right. I
It's like all of these books, there's very little, concrete proposals. But that's true. He does.
And he makes mentions about how silence is really important in Native American communities. And to be fair to him, not snark the whole thing, talking about how that's in contrast to I would say American. He talks about how that's really a white feature, that white people feel like they have to keep talking. But I think that's kind of our society, maybe because I'm a rambler. But saying that, silence is a sign of respect for a lot of people. It's a sign that people are actually thinking about what's going on. And so using silence, I think, can be very strategic and very helpful. And I don't mean strategic in this cunning, crafty way, but sometimes you just need to sit with the silence.
And they say, you shouldn't talk about religion, politics, and all these things at the workplace. There's the balance, but sometimes those are really you really wish that person had never said what they thought. And now you can't undo what they said.
The question is
and that relationship can't be healed.
But okay, you use this language of things getting derailed, but in what context in all of the different sites within this university is race not an issue?
Right.
I'm just not sure that there is this, that you can make that divide, that there's this important work, that this mission that we have, and if racial dynamics are operating in and through that institution, and on some level are gonna affect whether or not you achieve that mission, then they have to be addressed, right? So I mean, like, at least like, I mean, I'm not gonna defend the author of this book on every count, but I mean, I think that his overarching argument is just that, you know, if we don't work out how to have productive race talk, you know, we'll never get anywhere. And I don't disagree with that. I mean, to me, that seems totally reasonable.
I think that's right. And I think from a medical standpoint, sort of this dormant gene that's sitting there, a virus that's there, it's not active yet, but it's ever present, and it will activate at some point, and maybe the sooner you discover that it's there, the better you can create the prescription to solve it, you know, and so from that standpoint it can be somewhat helpful. But if it's underlying tension that's there but no one's talking about it, that's somewhat
How can you not have
damaging.
these conversations in the healthcare industry?
Well, I'm saying that's not even a but what if you have, yes, and what
Right.
if you only get,
The tension.
Sometimes
Yeah.
you need to bring in outside people.
But it's
Yeah.
risky,
Right.
I mean, and
It is.
risk
But it is
is,
risky.
I mean, but
Yeah.
that's one of his key themes, right? And that's always gonna be a key theme in race talk. I mean, that there is risk, threat, vulnerability, I mean, all of those things are gonna be at play all the time.
But that the biggest risk is
Not-
stopping the conversation
Yeah.
midway. Like that's the most dangerous thing, is when you say, okay, it's a little too uncomfortable, let's table this. That's when the damage is done. Okay, wait,
Ironically,
so all
we
these
have
questions-
4 minutes
wait.
left, so.
There's more questions.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, we
Yeah.
have more people, so
Yeah.
just.
I apologize, there's so much, so if I say something that doesn't make any sense, just check, make sure I'm saying something audible. But I guess like, I'm like validating, I'm validating what you said about like the risks and vulnerability. Well, I think that like is coded language though for making mistakes and this being messy. I didn't really introduce myself. I'm Brett Stackler. I'm one of the new program coordinators at the Center for Identity and Inclusion, and we have different workshops and curricula set up for race. But the thing in race talk is that you, especially like coming from, you know, a person who's gone through white racial identity, that you don't have these neat and perfect little conversations about race, that it's always messy, and this academic protocol keeps the messiness from happening. And the messiness that I'm talking about in particular is us making meaning of it of our own experiences. And so you can have a curricula, and you can have like an idea of what a conversation about race is going to look like, but what it's actually going to look like is going to be the process, and the process is going to be messy. And so I think we need to let ourselves have mistakes. One of the things that I've been learning here from students is that students feel as if they need to have these perfectly crafted narratives in order to participate in a conversation. And we're not perfectly crafted people, so then how can we have a perfectly crafted narrative in order to participate in a conversation? Like it's messy. Like talking about race is messy because this is one of the only spaces that we talk about it, right? Like how many people have had really critical, putting it through their own filter of their own identity conversations about race this week. So I just wanted to say that.
This guy in the hole.
My name is Chris Ahmed. I'm a graduate student at UIC, School of Public Health. I study epidemiology, so determinants of disease. And I'm, all the time we're learning about the problems of disease, and then once in a while, oh, here's a solution. And then back to the problem, oh, here's another solution. So one thing that was said earlier is condemning racism is socially accepted, but doing something about it is not. So my question is race talk? Is talk? Is this doing it? Is this enough? And if we're going to do this in the academic setting, is this aggressive enough? Is this going to bring about the change? Is this really what we can offer, the battle against racism is race talk?
Sorry.
No, we're all like,
Sorry. To me, it has to. That's the only thing I want to see. I just want to hear more talk. Sorry.
No, it's okay, I'll take more.
well, can we respond? Do we?
Yeah, I mean, yes.
I will say
I
this
was gonna
briefly.
respond.
Oh, well, no, I thought you did that.
No.
No, I think he does briefly talk about the fact that you have to be willing to take action and address like your own stuff, right? But then also, take it to a community level. But I think that's literally like where he stops. But that wasn't really the purpose of the
Talk
group.
is not literally talk. Talk is a conceptual framework of understanding yourself in the world, right?
Right.
Oh my God,
So
it's
that's-
so important.
But I mean, like, I don't see that as inconsequential. I mean, again, like, I don't
It's
see
not
that as
inconsequential.
inconsequential because that's gonna, unless you change your worldview and your understanding of what's going on around you, then you're not gonna do
do
other
anything.
concrete
Right.
actions, right? That what's inhibiting you from acting is that conceptual frame that race doesn't exist, or it's not a problem, or we're in a post-racial society, or whatever it is, right? Or race operates this way, I understand what race is, even though it actually operates
Right.
a different way.
Or I'm not a racialized being.
Yeah, it would all be better if there was just, if we were all just people and not
Or if we all just
racialized
Unicorns.
entities. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I apologize for coming late. I missed the beginning piece of it, but I driving here from Evanston like a mad woman. Got lost. But I saw the email about this and I was like, I have to get here because in Evanston they're doing all this talking. They love to talk in Evanston and me. And so I'm a new Evanston resident. I'm a psychologist and so I have a small practice up there. But I've been involved in helping to have some of these talks around race that are really uncomfortable. So I was coming here to get some understanding of framework. And so I think one of the things that I've noticed is that there's this academic bubble that Northwestern exists in from Evanston. And then coming down here and parking, it felt like a fortress. And I'm just like, what happened at the University of Chicago where there's a police officer on every corner? And so it just feels like
It's our civic engagement strategy.
Security.
but it says something to the community, and it's very much, it feels like it's very much about race. And so I just feel like in class, these intersections, and so I just feel like I would like to have some kind of conversation about how can the talks we have be productive and lead to action with framework, with this idea that race is, or racism, really, racism, is a sidebar thing that just happens to happen in America versus racism is the number one public health issue here in America. Let's just get on the same page, and then I think our talks may be more productive. I feel like there's this disagreement and this disagreement and disengagement from the idea of we're debating whether or not racism exists. Like you have to prove to people this is in fact the starting point versus let's just stop fucking around. This is what America was founded on. This is the framework from which everything has happened. And now what are we as a community going to do? And when young people come to university,